Okay, so I'm here today to talk to you about what were called fly girls, the WASP, the Women's Air Auxiliary Service Pilots in World War II. You know, when you think about women's service in World War II, we always think about Rosie the Riveter. That's the iconic picture. And you think of the women who worked in the factories and made the armaments and built the ships and built the planes. But women in World War II did not just make planes. They also flew them. And a lot of people don't know that. They didn't fly them in combat, and they didn't fly them overseas, but they flew them domestically. So this program was really set up by two really ace pilots, women who were ace pilots. Jackie Cochran was on a par, I would say, with Amelia Earhart in terms of her flying ability, her expertise, and she was quite famous within that kind of circle. The other woman was Nancy Harkness Lowe. She was also an ace pilot, married to a pilot. And both these women had ideas about what service women could provide when in World War II. Now, the British were way ahead of us. You know, the war started for Britain in 1939, September 1939. We didn't enter it until December 1941. So Britain was way ahead of us with accepting women into their air transport service. When Jackie Cochran and Nancy Harkness had posted that idea to the military in the United States wanted no part of it. But of course we were not at war yet. But the women were anticipating that we probably would be drawn in and that this would be a great service to the military. But they weren't having any of it. But the Brits, they were already at war, and they were having a desperate time trying to get enough planes, enough pilots, and you know, getting up to par to be able to fight off this horrific Luftwaffe, which was bombing, blitzing their cities in London every night. So their air transport service had been all male, and when it was posed that we should open up to women, there was a great opposition to it. But they were desperate. They needed the planes, and they needed pilots to man the planes domestically. So they had tremendous opposition to the notion that women would be flying the planes. And there were three rationales for this. That women would be taking men's jobs, which was ridiculous, because what the women would be doing, they'd be flying these planes from point of manufacture to point of deployment for combat. So the second reason there was opposition, they said it wasn't a suitable occupation for women. That women shouldn't be doing this. Well, the third one was girls can't fly. So with regard to the fact that it wasn't a suitable occupation for women, I'm going to show you this next slide that is going to probably, all the women in the audience are going to, the hair on the back of the neck is going to go up. There was an editor of a British journal called Aeroplane, and he wrote a really scathing article about women flying planes. And I'm just going to put up on the screen a portion of what he said. The menace is the woman who thinks she ought to be flying a high-speed bomber when she really has not the intelligence to throw at the floor of a hospital. Well, you can imagine the outcry when that was made public. But it didn't matter because any objection was overruled because they were so desperate for pilots, to fly these planes domestically and get the planes where they needed to be. So the ATS, the British ATS, opened it up to women. Well, Jackie Cochran, who had been spurned in her own country to fly domestically, she went over to Britain, and she brought 25 women pilots with her, and they flew for the ATS. And she became the first woman to fly a bomber across the Atlantic. So the third objection that girls can't fly was ridiculous. And these 25 women who joined her in the British Air Transport Service. But when America was drawn into the war in December of 1941, she returned. And the women who accompanied her over to the ATS, they came back with her. But this time, she had a lot of support for her proposal. Eleanor Roosevelt was in her corner. She wrote, and she had a daily column. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. I think it was called My Day. But she wrote, "This is not a time when women should be patient. We're at war, and we need to fight it with every weapon possible. And women pilots are a weapon waiting to be used." So, anyway, the military now was willing to listen. And the WASP was created. 25,000 women applied for these positions. 1,800 were accepted, and 1,074 eventually graduated. Now, there were very, very stringent conditions for the women who applied or who were accepted. They had to be a licensed pilot already before they came into the program. They had to have 200 flying hours, 21 to 35 age limit, be an American citizen, and pass the physical and the written cadet examination. And the cadet examination was the same as for men pilots. So it was quite a thing. So these women, they came from all over the country. They came from the cities. They came from the farms. They came by bus. They came by train, and some of them even hitchhiked. But wherever they came from, or however they got there, they had two things in common. They wanted to serve their country, and they desperately wanted to fly. Initially, the training took place at Houston Municipal Airport, but that was not a suitable location because the flying field was very busy because they had domestic flights, and there was no place for the women to be housed all together. So they moved over to Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, and that was a much better training field for them, and the women did have one place where they could be housed. But there was only one drawback to the housing arrangement, latrines. There was, for every 12 women, there were 2 sinks and 2 commodes and 2 shower heads. So you can imagine the kind of mayhem that they had at the first 6 a.m. revelry. But the women worked it out, and they worked out every challenge that came to them. And there were many. There was tremendous discrimination, among the male that they had to deal with. Okay, this is trainee Jeannie Bishop Parrish. She worked in 1942. She was a 19-year-old girl, and she was working as a bank teller near an air base in Avon Park, Florida. And the instructors that came in to cash their checks from the air base, all they could talk about was flying. The whole conversation was about flying. And she was intrigued. So she asked one of them, she said, you know, just because I'm a girl, does that mean I can't fly? And he said no. And he offered to teach her. And she was thrilled. So he did teach her. And that was the plane, the type of plane that she went up for her flight check. And she was sitting in the back of that Piper Cub. This was a solo that she was doing. And when she reached the altitude and she wanted to level off, the joystick, the hurl stick, came off in her hands. And now that would mean she would stall and crash if she couldn't get it. So she had great presence of mind. She whipped off her safety thing, reached over into the front of the Piper Cub, and she got hold of the joystick in the front, and she was able to control the plane and level it off. And then she climbed over and flew from the front. So when she landed the plane, her instructor was stunned, you know, by the presence of mind that she had, that she didn't panic, that she steadied the plane, she got over the seats, she flew the plane, and she landed safely. So he said to her, he said, you know, now you know that you have the stuff to be a pilot. And of course he passed her. But she was too young to join the WASP just yet. She was only 19 and you had to be 21. But the day she was 21, she put her application in. And they accepted her. Okay, I have a film clip now. And Deanie Parrish is going to narrate it for you, telling you about the training that the WASP women experienced.
November 1943, WASP Class 44-4 was reporting for training at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. Deanie Parrish was one of 95 new recruits to arrive on base.
I know that once I got in, we were told from the very beginning, do not write home and tell your family what you're doing. They didn't want the enemy to know because they said they would use it as propaganda that America was so hard up for pilots, they had to use women. Of course, they were having to use male pilots in the States to ferry aircraft, to train gunners, to train navigators and bombardiers and many, many other jobs that these male pilots were doing, that if somebody could relieve them, then they would go to combat. But of course, naturally, they weren't going to let girls go to combat. It was 1,000 wonders that they would let us fly. But we got to Sweetwater, got off the train, and there was one big hotel, the Blue Line Hotel, and we all assembled there. In the meantime, I met a girl that was also going to be in the same class. And during those days, women dressed up. You wore your hat, you wore your gloves, and you wore your high heels. And naturally, we were there to, to make an impression. So the next morning when we got up, we knew that we were going to have transportation out to the field, which was maybe 2 miles out of town. So we all were dressed. I don't think I had on a hat, but I certainly had on gloves. We all come downstairs and we go out to our transportation, and here are 3 cattle trucks lined up. That's our transportation.
Trains of Ventureville, Parloo. Trains of Ventureville, Parloo. My flag sing with the boys who really this spring. Dinky, dinky, Parloo.
Training was military training, and living was military living. WASP lived in barracks, did PT, and wore uniforms, all part of Jackie Cochran's plan. But there was a twist.
Jacqueline Cochran was there, which that was a thrill. We all assembled, and she got up and began to talk to us and to tell us about what the program was about, what to expect. And then she said something that I have never forgotten. She said, you may be in a man's world, and you may be flying a man's airplane, but I want you to remember, when you get out of that airplane, you're a lady. I want you to look like a lady, and I want you to act like a lady. I've never forgotten it. I think the only thing I thought about is if I can help so that some man can go over and fight this war. That's all that was important. It was not only we who flew airplanes. Everybody was doing something for their country. There were women who were driving ambulances and fire trucks. There were women that go into the factories to work that took off their petticoats, and they went to the factories and began working. And women in those days weren't expected to do those kind of things, but our country needed us.
Okay. Venture Field in Sweetwater, Texas, was the only all-female air base. In the first weeks of operation, when male pilots nearby heard about the all-woman air base, they began to make a lot of emergency landings. And it got so bad that the base commander closed the field to traffic except for what's called true emergencies, earning Venture Field the name Cochrane's Convent. And I don't know if you can see what's written up there, none for you. The only uniforms that the Army provided were men's coveralls. And the girls called them zoot suits. And you can see they were, anything that the government gave them was made for men. So the women wore them in the shower. And then they hung them on the clothesline in the back of the barracks, hoping that they would shrink. And they rolled them up and they cut them off. They did whatever they could to make them functional. It wasn't until 1944 that the women finally did get their own uniforms. And then when they did, they had to pay for them. Mornings of training were spent on the ground in school, and afternoons were spent in the air, practicing takeoffs, spins, and turns, and stalls, and landings, most importantly, landings. They also had an hour of aerobics drill and an hour of marching. There was a young male lieutenant, and he was watching them with their, awkward attempts at marching, and he took it upon himself to teach them the Army way. So he organized them, and he had them marching to the mess hall. He marched them to and from the airfield, to their barracks, wherever they went, he had them marching. And they made up their own songs, and they sang them when they marched. And they even made up a song about the lieutenant who was their instructor. And they were quite amusing, some of these songs. Here you see a wishing well, and all the women were constantly and continuously evaluated by their civilian instructors. Military pilots actually took them up for official Army flight tests. So before each check ride, the women, whoever was going up for the check ride, would go to the wishing well, toss in a coin, and say a prayer for good luck. Life did a cover on the wishing well. In the bottom of the right, you can see the Life logo. That was the cover of one of their magazines. Those who passed, they ran. There was a big bell, big fire bell near the administration building, and they rang it whenever a girl passed the check flight. And they'd all come and they'd celebrate the successful flight check. This is an AT-6 trainer aircraft. By graduation, the women had 210 flying hours and over 300 hours in the ground school. And remember, when they came in, they already had 200 hours flight. So they were really well-qualified pilots. As the war progressed and the Army needed more and more pilots, flying time for admission to the WASP was dropped, really 35 hours they had to have before they were accepted into the program. At first, you know, the Army did not, they wanted to keep a lid on publicity about the WASP program. As Jeannie Parrish had said, you know, that they were afraid that the enemy would use it as propaganda, saying that the U.S. was so desperate they had to have women. And also they wanted to keep it quiet in case it didn't work out. It wouldn't be a big publicity thing. So, but they changed that soon. The gal on your left is called Lillian Yonley. She kept a contraband camera. They weren't supposed to take pictures. It was supposed to be hush-hush, but she did it anyway. She wanted to have like a photographic diary of her training. So she did it in secret. And, you know, it really turned out, history was glad that she did, because NPR, a few years ago, they did a special on the WASP, and they used a lot of the photographs that Lillian Yonley had taken. Here's a Life magazine cover, WASP Shirley Slade. That was July 13th, 1943. She's sitting on the wing of her airplane. And as I said, although the government wanted to keep it quiet initially, by that time, you know, they were confident that it was working and that they could publicize it. Now I want to introduce you to Margaret Phelan. She was 19 years old and she grew up on a farm in Iowa. She had just finished 2 years of college. And when she saw that magazine cover with Shirley Slade on it, it sparked her imagination. Her brother was training to be an Army pilot, and she thought, well, why not me? You know, but she needed to take flying lessons in order to be qualified for the program. So she begged her father. She said, I begged him. I told him, I simply had to do this. I needed the money. And it was $500 for the training program, the civilian training program that she wanted to enter. And he did give it to her, and she did pass it. She said, there was just one problem. I was a half inch too short for the height requirement. So I stood on my toes. And when I arrived at Avenger Field, she said, I realized there were a lot of short ones like me. And she said, I never did pay my father back the $500 that he didn't want. This is Miss Beefanella. She was a gremlin, and she was originally drawn by Walt Disney. But with his permission, the women adopted her as their mascot. Now, gremlins would usually seem to be, you know, trouble, but they used her as their good luck mascot. And they had a patch made with her representation on it, and they put it on their uniforms, and they had it painted on their airplanes. So Miss Beefanella was a gremlin with moxie. And the WASP women, they were women with moxie too. This is a photograph of WASP Bee Hager. I had the honor of meeting Bee and her fellow WASP, Shirley Cruz, in Florida a few years ago. How that came about, I was introduced to them by a man whose mother had been a WASP. And I was going to do this program at a library in Florida. And when he saw that, he asked them to contact me. And we got together, and you're seeing the same presentation that he and I did. But then he arranged for, he knew Bee Hazel and Shirley Cruz and a number of other WASPs because of his mother. And he also was a pilot. So we invited them to do a separate presentation and talk about their experiences in the WASP. And it was wonderful. They told such great stories. They had wonderful senses of humor. And it was wonderful. I had a wonderful time. We had dinner with them, and the next day we had lunch. And Dee has since passed away. I think about 2 years ago she passed away. But when her health declined, she ended up in a nursing home. But there was a special women's get-together of pilots in Florida, not too far from where her nursing home was. And they celebrated her. They all went up as a group, and when they flew over the nursing home, they dipped their wings, and she was outside in a wheelchair and waving a flag in front. So it was really quite nice. And I just felt thrilled that I had that opportunity to meet a woman of that caliber. So I don't know how many WASP are left now. In 2019, there is a museum in Sweetwater, Texas, for the WASP, and they had some statistics as of 2019, but I'm not sure now what they are. So, well, the big fear of the women was washing out. Nobody wanted to wash out. The women helped each other. If a girl was having problems with some aspect of training, the other girls would work with her, try to bring her up to speed. There wasn't competition, there was cooperation, there was collaboration, and great camaraderie. They had great sense of humor, their songs and their desire to be of service to their country, but unfortunately, about 50% of each class did wash out. And it wasn't usually because they couldn't fly, but it had to do with, failing in some other aspect. They were failing in doing it maybe the Army way, or maybe they accumulated too many demerits. They had a demerit system. They had, all of these regulations. If they accumulated too many, they were out. And there was no recourse. So, you had to observe a curfew. Oh, I'm sorry. Were you able to hear me back there? Sorry. You had to observe a curfew. Lights out at a certain time. Fraternization with male personnel was absolutely forbidden. Alcohol was forbidden. But the last two, I think, weren't so strictly observed. There were many bottles hidden in many places. And I think that there was some fraternization. Here's another Life magazine cover. This is a WASP taking a nap in the ready room. These are the silver wings that the WASP were awarded when they graduated. And after they graduated, they were given a number of assignments. Some ferry planes, from point of manufacture to military bases. Some towed targets, they had these big targets and they towed them. And the gunnery, and the male gunners were practicing, see how expert they were at hitting the proper target. And some were test pilots, and some of the women became instructors. All the girls were anxious to fly every manner of aircraft that they could. Here's Deanie Parrish again. One day, as she was getting ready to pilot a tow cargo plane, the pilot of the plane, the gunnery plane, got close as she was getting into the cockpit, and he thought she was pretty cute. So he flew very close to her when he was, aiming at the target, and he got too close. He wanted to get a better look, and he got too close, and he hit the tail of the plane. Well, she was able to land safely, but she was furious, and she told him off, and she told her roommate, if it's the last thing I do, I'm going to get even with him. Well, she did get a union. She married him. So, now, here they are getting ready, or they're leaving their B-17. That was a 4-engine plane. It was called Big Friend because its size and its reliability, the pilots could rely on. So that photograph is called Pistol Pack and Mama. Here's a P-51 pursuit plane. 5 WASPs crashed to their deaths before these planes ever reached combat zones. The momentum of production of aircraft was at such a fever pitch in 1944, with factories working day and night and turning out up to 15 planes every 4 hours. On every maiden flight, whether in a new P-51 or T-37, women in effect served as test pilots and guinea pigs for the men fighter groups overseas who would be the next ones in the cockpit. The WASPs left them notes in the cockpit to wish them luck, and they sealed them with a kiss with their lipstick. So it was quite something. And here, the B-26. One of the great contributions that the WASPs made was that they were used to goad the male pilots into flying aircraft that they deemed too dangerous to fly. When the B-26 was a twin-engine bomber, when it was introduced, the men dubbed it the flying prostitute because the wings were so short it seemed to have no visible means of support. Morale among the B-26 trainees was very low, so the Army called an entire training base in Alabama to witness the demonstration. Unbeknownst to the men, WASP were piloting the B-26. When the planes landed and taxied up the runway and 4 WASP got out of the plane, the men were shocked, and the grumbling about flying with the B-26 soon ceased. Because of their success in this, an additional 100 WASPs were allowed to fly the B-26s, and they performed demonstrations for over a year without mishap. Okay, here's the B-29. That was a super fortress. This scenario about reluctance to fly a plane was repeated with the B-29. It was a colossal plane. It had been hastily pushed through production and rolled out in 1944 without years of operational testing and modifications that have earned the B-17 the name Big Friend, because it was reliable, it had been proven, but not so with the B-29, and there were some difficulties with it. Can you hear me back there? Everybody can hear? Okay. So the men in the base were very reluctant to train on this behemoth plane. As I said, it was 25 feet longer and twice the bulk of the B-17. So, Lieutenant Paul Tibbets, he was in charge of the training program, and he had heard of the success of the WASP women with the B-26. So he took 2 WASP pilots, Dora Doherty and Dorothea Johnson, who had not even flown a 2-engine plane before, and he got them together. And in 3 days of nonstop training, he had them flying the B-29. So on the huge nose of the Superfortress, he had the WASP mascot, Miss Vanilla, emblazoned on it, and called it Ladybird. And he arranged for a demonstration. He had, all of the training personnel, the male training personnel, gathered together, and he had a demonstration of the B-29 in flight. And when they landed, again, women came out, and the men, were shot. Anyway, he started to take them around the country to other bases where training was going on and do these demonstrations. And they were so successful that it was quite a sensation. And they crisscrossed the country. They'd have pilots, crew chiefs, bombardiers, and gunners aboard to show them, how they flew this plane. And they flew so well that when the news reached Washington, the chief of the air staff wired Tibbets and told him to stop. They have to stop, the WASPs have to stop flying the Super Fortress. Immediately. He said to boost morale was one thing, he said. But the girls were putting the big football players to shame. Okay. Here's another story about a B-29. One day, as the WASP were calling into an airfield controlled by Charo to get landing instructions, a very exasperated controller got on the air and he said, "Lady, you got to get off the radio. I'm expecting a B-29. Sir, I am B-29. She radioed him. The WASP flew every airplane that the Air Force had in its arsenal. Multi-engine bombers, pursuit fighter planes, cargo planes. They test piloted new and refurbished planes. They towed targets for ground and air gunnery practice with live ammunition. They did everything their nation asked them to do. And they were tremendously proud to be serving their country, doing what they loved to do, which was flying. And you can see some of the planes that they flew. In America's time of need, 1,100 women flew 77 types of aircraft over 60 million miles. But they were a civil volunteer organization. They had no insurance. They got $250 a month to fly the most dangerous planes and heavy planes. They had to pay their own board. They had to buy their own uniforms. They had no benefits whatsoever. 38 women were killed serving their country. Their bodies were sent home in poorly crafted pine boxes. Burial was at the expense of their families or classmates. Because they were considered not military, no gold stars were permitted in their parents' windows. No American flags were permitted on the coffins at their funerals, as was done for the male pilots, but some families just did it anyway. And a lot of times, the girls, their colleagues, they passed the hat, and they paid for the burial expenses of their colleagues. And one or two of the WASP would accompany the body home, took her home to her parents. It was really such a horrible, shattered way of treating them.
Did the British treat their women the same as we did?
No, no. Militarization. Jackie Cochran had believed that the WASP would be militarized, like the WASP and the Waves, who had all of the benefits. And General Hap Arnold, he supported that initiative. But in June of 1944, Congress there was a House bill to give the WASP military status, and that was defeated, largely because of intensive lobbying against it by civilian male pilots. And that was because, things were winding down in the air war. You didn't have now the kind of production that had been early in the war. And the male civilian pilots, they were exempt from the draft. So now that things were slowing down, they were afraid that they were going to be sent overseas, as a combat troop. And so they just really mounted tremendous opposition, and they persuaded the Congress that the WASP should not be militarized. So they had no veteran status, no access to the GI Bill, or other benefits that were accorded to their counterparts. The last class, General Hap Arnold said to the last class, he said, I salute you, you and all the WASP, we of the Army Air Force are proud of you. We will never forget our debt to you. Well, and he also said, when the program started, he said, I wasn't sure whether a slip of a girl could fight the controls of a B-17 in heavy weather. But he said they proved that they could fly wingtip to wingtip with their pilot brothers. He said the Air Force would never forget them, never forget its debt to them. But after the war, not only were they forgotten, but the records of their service were classified and sealed for 35 years. So their contributions were unknown and unavailable to historians. It was as though they had never existed. Heading home. Lillian Yonley remembers on the last day, we were dismissed from our base. There was no ceremony, not a damn thing. And if we could, we hopped airplanes to get back home. Those who couldn't get rides paid their own way home. Most of the women were really devastated with the dissolution of the program. One WASP called it the saddest day of my life. Another, it broke my heart. After the war, very few could get jobs flying. Certainly no major airline, commercial airline would ever hire a woman. And so the women went on with their lives, their experiences as WASP, largely forgotten, for 3 decades. But what changed? In 1976, now the Air Force was accepting women pilots into the Air Force, and it had announced that it was training the first women to fly military aircraft. Well, the WASP nest stirred. They were outraged, and they mobilized to set the record straight, to claim their status as the first women pilots to fly military aircraft, and to push again for military status. Finally, recognition. After a 33-year battle, President Jimmy Carter, I know that's so popular, President Jimmy Carter signed legislation granting the WASP full military status. On July 1st, 2009, President Obama signed a bill to award the Congressional Gold Medal to the WASP. Dee Parrish again, she's back again. She, on March 10th, 2010, she accepted the Congressional Gold Medal on behalf of all the women Air Force service pilots. In accepting the award, Jeannie said, the women had volunteered to fly the planes without expectation that they would ever be thanked. She said, over 65 years ago, we served our country without any expectations of recognition or glory. And we did it without compromising the values that we were taught growing up. She said we did it because our country needed us. And here we have pictures of the back and front of the gold medal honoring the WASP. So I have another story for you. This is Betty Strohan. On the left, you see the older Betty Strohan, and she's being honored at a Nevada Air Base. But on the right, she's shown as a young WASP. Before moving, I have a film clip about this, but before we get to that, I have a couple of stories about Betty. As part of the training session to prepare the infantrymen for strafing, enemy strafing, Betty was ordered to take her plane up to 500 feet and, do a mock strafing of these men in an adjacent field. But she misunderstood him. She thought he said 50 feet. So she comes roaring in at 50 feet to these poor guys in the field, to mock and strafe them. Well, they not only hit the dirt, they ate the dirt. So anyway, she lands nearby, and this sergeant came raging up to her, and he demanded to know who was the pilot who buzzed his men, and he needs to know. And she said, well, I'm your pilot, sir. And he said, I'm going to report you. And she said, well, what did I do? And he said, well, you scared the hell out of my men, out of my boys. And she said, well, where are you boys going? He said, well, they're going into combat. He said, and I want them to live to get there. And she said, well, sir, I want them to live to get home, and they're going to face a lot worse from the Nazis. So she finished putting on lipstick. In another exercise, she and her comppilot came in low over a field, and there was a single soldier crossing the field. After they made their pass, and they looked back, they said to her mate, she said, he didn't look too scared, did he? And so they came back, and they came in lower, and this time he ripped off his t-shirt, and he was waving at them in surrender. She was a real hot ticket. So, here's another film clip. Yeah, and then we gotta go back here. Let's see. Should be. Now, should be some sound with that. Go back a minute. No? way to, Joanna, is there any way sound, it should have been sound, but just a minute. I don't know what happened to the sound on this. Yeah, it's not,
Like this is,
on June 24th, 2017, the field at Faribault Municipal Airport was renamed the Liz Wall Strofus Field in honor of Betty.
What state was Faribault in?
Pardon me?
What state?
Nevada.
It was in Nevada.
Yeah. So she received what you would have seen there had I had something happen with this. She was 93, I think, at the time. They were honoring her at this base. And she received an award from one of the Thunderbird pilots, a female Thunderbird pilot. And they took her up in a Thunderbird, and she was just thrilled. And she talked about how proud she was to have received the award, and that how she would love to have been a Thunderbird pilot. That she just thought that was terrific. And so you saw her, interacting with the Thunderbird pilots, and it was a very nice clip. But anyway, so anyway, they did rename the field in honor of her. There was another battle that the WASP fought. In 2015, the Secretary of Defense, McHugh, ruled that the WASP and other World War II veterans classified as active duty designees were not eligible for internment at Arlington. Well, Elaine Harmon, who flew a P-51 plane, when she died at the age of 95, her family, in accordance with her wishes, attempted to have her buried, or interred, at Arlington. The cemetery's director denied the family's request, citing the McHugh ruling. Harmon's family fought it, and in May of 2016, President Obama signed legislation that permitted the WASP pilots to be interred at Arlington. Posthumously, Harmon brought down one more barrier for the WASP. So the approximately 100 WASPs who were still living at that time were now entitled to be buried with full honors at Arlington. And Harmon's ashes were interred in September of 2016 after a 21-gun salute and a flyover the planes that she had piloted. Okay, this is a cartoon. And little boy sitting next to his grandma told her they're studying World War II in school, and I think it's about time you and I talked about how you flew a Dauntless dive bomber for the Navy in the war. And here is the Douglas Dauntless dive bomber. That's the one that Grandma flew when she was young and a Dauntless WASP. In the words of one WASP, it was heaven up there. You can't get any closer to God than you are up there. This is the WASP museum that's been constructed at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. And they have all kinds of events there and memorabilia from the WASP and their time in the WASP. Still flying high. So I think, a good way to end this program is with some pictures of some of the brave and beautiful young women who gave really unstintingly and joyfully of themselves in the war years. It took almost 60 years for them to achieve this recognition of their valiant service. But they did achieve it. And I thank you for coming today on this rainy day and helping us to celebrate these terrific women and their contributions to the country that we all love so much. Thank you. And if anyone has questions or comments that they'd like to make, we have time. Yes.
Were there any pilots in the WASP?
Among the WACs. If there were pilots, they weren't flying, for the military. I think they would have to have been a member of the WASP. I mean, they could have flown on their own, but not with the military. Not that I know of, anyway. But, the sad part about this was, they just wanted to fly, they just wanted to give to their country, and they were treated so shabbily. I mean, it was awful, really. A real shame, a blot on our country for that time. And it was political. It was all political. So, but today we honor them. Glad to let people know about them. So, and there are books written about them, and there are films about them. So. Anybody else? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.